My name is Max Bonner. Today's December 1st, 2011, and I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee to interview Justice William M. Barker. This interview is taking place as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation in conjunction with the Tennessee Supreme Court Historical Society. Judge Barker, I've looked forward to this time to interview you, which is being on the a different side of the table. Please, for the record, sounding like a deposition, tell us your full name.
My full name is William Muecke Barker, and the Muecke is spelled a little differently than you would expect.
Please spell it for us.
It's M-U-E-C-K-E.
What is the provenance of that name?
Well,
Muecke?
my great-grandfather was German. I think he was from Silesia, although other folks say he may have been from Austria. But anyway, they migrated to the United States in the 1850s, and that was their surname. His name was John Edward, and it was pronounced Muecke. And Muecke is a pretty difficult name for the people in Kingston, Tennessee to pronounce, and so they just started calling him Mr. Muecke. And I shouldn't say this, Max, but in German, that name Muecke, it means mosquito. And that was his surname. And every generation, someone gets stuck with it, and it was my turn to get stuck with it.
I am a great believer in passing those names down. My names are the same sort. They're old family names which have been dusted off and used again. When did he leave this world?
1934.
So
and I wasn't around.
You
at
did
that
not
point.
ever get to know him?
No.
What did you know about him besides his name?
My mother used to say that he still spoke a little German, although he was almost an infant when they came to the United States. But when it was time for them to go somewhere, my mother remembers him saying, "Ich bin fertig," which means I am ready. And that's about all she remembers about it, except he loved to sit around the radio this was in Orem, Tennessee, which most people never heard of. And he would listen to the radio in the early 30s, and he wanted to listen to Lum and Abner. That was his favorite show, and that's about all I remember being told.
Tell us about your mother and dad.
Well, my mother was born in 1914. My father was born in 1909. They met when they were at the Marion County High School in Jasper, Tennessee, which at that point was a boarding school. It was in a rural county, and nobody had cars much, and so they would come to Jasper on the week, Sunday afternoon, and they would start school on Monday. And then on Friday afternoon when school was out, and they had a little dormitory there, and on Friday afternoon when school was out, they would all try to get back to their homes to have their mothers do their wash and then come back Sunday night the best way they could. My father lived on a farm about 3 miles up from Powell's Crossroads. My mother lived in a little town called Orem, Tennessee, which was a mining town. You couldn't get to Orem without going into Alabama first, and it had about 500 people. Now it's almost gone. It's almost a ghost town. That's where they met.
What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Mary Eleanor Carpenter.
And your father's name?
His name was William Frank Barker.
Did you have any brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have one older brother. His name is Frank Edward Barker. He's 3 years older than I am. I'm 70 now, and he's 73, and he's a practicing lawyer down in Corpus Christi, Texas. Mainly does insurance defense work. And at the age of 73, he's one of the few lawyers who doesn't settle many cases. He likes to try them. He does a lot of trial work, even now.
Tell us about things you remember from your boyhood.
Well, I remember growing up in Highland Park, 2305 Duncan Avenue. The house is condemned now. My father at that point was driving a bus, a Southern Coach Line bus during the World War II. He drove a bus between downtown Chattanooga and old Fort Oglethorpe, which had been the home of the 6th Cavalry. And then as soon as the war started, they turned it into a whack post. and he was 34 years old. I think the cutoff for the draft was 35, but he was exempted because they said he was doing a meaningful job driving bus back and forth between the Army posts. My mother worked in a wartime factory. It was called the American Lava Company. You may know where that was located, over in North Chattanooga.
Building's still there.
Building is still there. And my father was the bus driver, and I remember, the first thing I remember was seeing a big headline on a newspaper, and it was, my father and mother laid it down on the, we call it the footstool. Some people call it an ottoman. That's an old family joke, by the way. But anyway, they laid down, I remember these headlines that big, and I was about 3.5, 4 years old. And I remember they said, "We've invaded Europe, D-Day." And that was my first memory. And I remember when victory over Japan came about, and they brought me downtown, and I don't know where they came from, but all these soldiers and sailors were all over downtown Chattanooga just dancing and going crazy. And I remember saying, boy, and I do remember going out to Old Fort Oglethorpe one Sunday afternoon. We only were allowed 3 gallons of gas a week. And we went out to Fort Oglethorpe one Sunday afternoon, and my father said, "Now see those people cutting the grass over there? They're German prisoners." And I said, "Germans? They look just like anybody else." You know, I thought they would be monsters, but I remember seeing the German prisoners there.
And yet we both have German heritage.
Yeah, yeah.
Our great-grandfathers both
Yeah.
came to this country from Germany. A lot of the people who are going to hear this don't know what in the world a WAC is.
Women's Army Corps.
And what did the WACs do?
I don't know. I have no idea.
But there were also,
I think they were supposed to have assisted in the war somehow.
there were also waves, were there
Wave.
not, for the women who were in the Navy?
Yes, yes. Of course, we didn't have a separate Air Force then. It was the Air Corps, so I guess the WACs would have served both the Army and the Air Force.
What are some of your other memories as a child?
I remember we had a city playground right straight across the street from our house, and we had a picture window in our living room, and my mother wanted me to take piano lessons, and I was about 9 years old. And so I had to go to take the piano lessons once a week, and I was supposed to practice every afternoon after school. So I'd sit there at this little upright piano trying to practice, and I would look out the picture window and see all my friends playing baseball and swinging and playing in the sand pile. And the piano lessons lasted about a year, and I quit and went to the playground.
Do you still like to plink around on a piano?
No, my wife's the player. I don't do anything. I can barely play anything but the television and the radio.
Well, I know you have a piano in your house, and I
Yes.
thought maybe you still like to sit
No.
down and.
No, that's my wife.
What are some of the other things you remember about?
Well, I remember I
childhood?
went into business when I was about 10 years old. I remember I said there was this playground across the street, so I got the bright idea, a friend of mine and I did, that we were going to sell snowballs. And there was an ice company on Macaulay Avenue, right, Goree Ice Plant, and I went over there and I bought big bags of crushed ice. My mother got Kool-Aid and put a lot of sugar in it to make the syrup, and we bought cones, and I had an ice cream snowball stand out in the front yard, and we were selling for 10 cents a piece. And during the summer, I was making about $12 a week doing that.
Well, 10 cents in those days was a lot of money.
Right, it cost 10 cents to go to the old Park Theater. My mother would give me 11 cents on Saturdays, and I would hike up to the Park Theater, which is the neighborhood movie theater. It cost 10 cents to get in, and then when the show was over, we had a double feature. We had the Three Stooges, we'd have cartoons, we'd have movie tone news, and a cereal. And by the time the show started at 1 o'clock, and I would get through about 5:45. And on the way home, I'd stop at Bob Ritchie's donut shop, and with that extra penny, I'd get a day-old donut. And my mother got rid of me all afternoon for 11 cents.
Tell people what a cereal is.
Well, a cereal was a thing that was started back in the 30s and ran all the way, I guess, up until the 40s. And they would have these, it was a way to get kids to come to the movies every week. You'd have 12 or 13 chapters. And the hero would always be right at death's door when that chapter was over. You say, how can he get out of this? You know, the railroad track he's tied down to, and the train's going to come across him. And somehow you'd go back the next week, and miraculously he would escape. I remember seeing a Batman and Robin serial where the Batman Batmobile was a 1939 Packard.
Well, what are some of the other things you enjoyed as a youngster?
Well, I did like to play baseball. That was the only sport that I was any good at. I wasn't good in football. I was too slow. Never did learn how to dribble a basketball, but I was pretty good at baseball, and I played that almost year-round. Even when it was wintertime, if I could get up a gang, we'd play baseball.
What was your favorite position?
Shortstop.
That takes quickness.
Well, I wasn't too bad at turning the double play, but if you wanted me to run to first base, it would take me a while to get there. Somehow I managed, but
Did you like to bat?
yeah, I never was a home run hitter, but I hit a lot of singles.
Tell us about how you all would choose up teams on Saturday afternoon, those pickup games.
Well, we'd take a bat, wooden bat. We didn't have metal bats back then. I still don't like metal bats, but we'd have a baseball bat, and we'd start doing this. And when you get to the top, the guy at the top would be the first one to choose. And he would choose, and then the second guy would make his choice, and we'd come up with our teams. Sometimes might only have 5 on a team. Sometimes might have 10 on a team.
Do you still follow baseball?
No, I got mad at the baseball organization back about 10 or 12 years ago when the players went on strike, and I just kind of never went back. I'm now a big pro football and college football and basketball fan.
What are your favorite teams?
Favorite football teams?
Yeah.
Well, of course, University of Tennessee for my football team in college, and then the Tennessee Titans for my professional team. And after them, the Colts, and the Colts only because of Peyton Manning.
Another Tennessee product.
Right.
When did you start school?
Started school in September 1947 at the old Ridgedale Grammar School in the first grade. We didn't have kindergartens back then, and your first experience in school was first grade.
What do you remember about some of those early days in school? Do you remember your first day at school?
I remember my first day at school. The night before I left to go to school, my mother sat me down and said, now we're going to memorize your home address in case something happens and you need to be able to get somebody to bring you home. This is your address. And school was about a mile from our house, and so I walked to school with my brother. He was 3 years older. My mother trusted us to go together. And back in those days, you never heard of child abductions or anything of that nature. So I remember being taught my address so I could spout it out if I needed to.
We've got a technical problem and we need to take a break.
Okay, good.
Do you remember the name of your first teacher?
Ms. Shurter, S-H-U-R-T-E-R.
Did you have fun at school?
Yes. That year, there was another lady I had later named Ms. Jones, and that wasn't fun. She was my 5th grade teacher.
Did they paddle during those days?
Oh, yes, and I felt the brunt of it a lot. I remember when I went to Macaulay School in the 7th grade. This was in 1953. And I was taking geography. That was a required course for the 7th graders, and the geography teacher was a fellow named John Day. John was a huge man. He was about 6'4", weighed about 280 pounds. He was the football line coach, and he also doubled as the 7th grade geography teacher. And our geography book was about like this. And in those days, it was a military school, and if you messed up, they'd give you marks. And if you had a certain number of marks, you had to come on Saturday and march laps. And so when you'd mess up in the geography class, Mr. Day would say, I'll give you your choice, 5 licks or 5 marks, take your choice. And foolishly, the first time I messed up like that, I said, I'll take the licks. He said, great, bend over and grab your ankles. And he took that geography book and he whacked me. He knocked me almost all the way across the room. And so from then on, if I messed up, I said, I'll take the marks.
And I'm sure that never happened often. But it is fun to think about the changes in discipline in school. What was your favorite part of school when you were in grammar school before you got to high school?
Favorite part? Well, I guess it was when they named me to be on the safety patrol.
Did you get to wear a belt?
Got to wear a little belt, and it was a white belt. It was sort of like a sash, and we were out on Dodds Avenue, which is a fairly busy street, and I used to be able to go out and put up my thing and make the traffic stop, and I was a big shot. And I had a little girlfriend. Her name was Peggy Oldham, and I couldn't wait for her to come out and see me doing my thing. I thought that was pretty impressive. I don't know that Peggy did, but I did.
Why did you go to private school rather than to public school after you got through with grammar school?
My mother thought it was the best thing for me, and I went 3 years, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade at Macaulay, and then my parents divorced, and the money sort of ran out, and so I transferred to Old Chattanooga High School, and it was a public school, but in those days it was as good or better than any of our private schools, and I flourished there. It was co-ed, and I liked that. And Macaulay was just all male. Both great schools, but I got to experience both the public and the private. So it turned out pretty well, although it wasn't, I didn't think so at the time.
Who was the principal there when you
At City High School?
City High School.
Creed Bates, a legend.
Colonel Creed
Colonel
Bates.
Creed Bates. Loved that man.
There were as many merit scholars from
Yeah.
City High School as there were from Macaulay and Baylor in
Absolutely.
those days.
It was an interesting school because it was we only really had two big schools in town, City and Central. We had other schools, but they weren't the big ones.
Millsaps was at Central.
Right. And at City High School, it was only the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. We had about 1,470 students in those three classes. And in that group, you would have people who were just on a vocational tract. They'd be taking woodworking, auto mechanics. You'd have other people that were taking college AP courses. We'd all be in the same homeroom. We all got along well together. It was just an ideal school. Ideal school.
How did it happen that you went to Macaulay rather than Baylor?
Because I lived 3 blocks from Macaulay. And it's interesting, my 2 boys both went to Baylor, and I catch a lot of grief over that.
Well, since we're talking about your sons, we'll fast forward ahead and ask you their names and when they were born, and then we'll come back to Kathy and some other things.
Well, my oldest son is John Edward Barker. His birthday was April 1st, 1969. He was my April Fool. He's now in New York, and he's in the real estate mortgage business. He's married and has 2 children, live in Connecticut, and he rides that train every day into New York City. My second son is David Muecke. I stuck him with it, but we call him David. And he is lives about half a mile from me, and he has 3 children. He's a practicing OB/GYN here in Chattanooga. My third child is my daughter Martha Eleanor Barker, and her birthday was December the 10th, 1973. David, by the way, was born on New Year's Day, 1972. Martha's married and has 2 children. She's a stay-at-home mom.
Let's go back now to your undergraduate education, because that's really a formative time in your life. What were some of the things that you learned before you went to Macaulay that really influenced you?
Before I went to Macaulay, that would be
when you were in grammar school, in public school.
Well, I remember not only was I involved with the snowball stand, but I used to cut yards, and I used to have to do a lot of housework, so I guess I learned the value of work.
Pretty valuable.
Yeah.
In practicing law, you really had to practice with a lot of work.
And we got heavily involved in our church when I was in the 5th grade, and I learned the value of a relationship with God.
Which church was that?
It was Old Westminster Presbyterian Church, which is now gone. I now go to First Presbyterian Church.
But did your mother and father go to church with you?
My mother did. My father didn't.
And did Eddie, your older brother, go to church with you?
Yes.
Then what effect did Macaulay School have on you as you matured?
As I matured, it had a great effect. At the time, there were times I was at Macaulay and I wasn't happy. I told you I lived about 3 blocks from McCauley, and most of my friends came from Lookout Mountain or Signal Mountain or Missionary Ridge, and I was the only guy in this class that lived within walking distance of the school. And that was not the world's greatest neighborhood. It was a lower middle class neighborhood. And at that time, when I was in the 7th and 8th grade, I began to feel like I wasn't as good as the other guys because I wasn't as rich, and I wasn't able to have them over to my home. And they were inviting me to Lookout Mountain to stay with them. And all that later I knew was just really superficial. But at a young age, that concerned me.
Did you form some friendships in those days which have stayed with you?
Oh, absolutely. Scott Brown, lawyer here in Chattanooga, was one of my classmates. Old Gus Wood was one of my classmates. Lanny Goins was one of my classmates. Johnny Killebrew was one of my classmates. We had a great class. In fact, they had their 50th reunion 2 years ago and invited me to come to the reunion. And I said, well, I wasn't a graduate of McCauley. I only lasted 3 years. They said, we want you to be a part of it. So I'm considered an alum of McCauley and Chattanooga High School, only because of those good friends. It was really sort of a fake alumni.
I wouldn't call that a fake alumni, but it meant that you were a vital part of their school experience too, for them to want you back.
Maybe.
Did you enjoy the uniform?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Max, that was one of the things that I really seriously considered making a career, was the Army. I was 3 years at McCauley. It was a military school. Then at City High School, we had ROTC, and when in my senior year, I got named the regimental commander, which was a big shot deal, I thought. And then when I went to UTC, which was then called UC, University of Chattanooga, I was in ROTC, and I was I wasn't the regimental commander, I was second in command. And so I thought, maybe the military is for me, and I really seriously thought about making the military a career. My wife talked me out of it.
Well, I'm glad she did, but uniforms, to describe the uniform at McCauley.
It was a unique uniform. Baylor was gray. That was what most of the military schools were, but McCauley was a dark navy blue. Navy blue.
And describe the exterior of the uniform itself, the buttons and the...
Well, they were gold buttons. I never got far enough along to get many stripes at McCauley, but if you had a stripe, they were gold too.
Did you?
I was a private.
But you enjoyed that?
Yeah, loved it. Used to spit shine my shoes, get the brasso out and make sure my brass looked like, make your eyes knock out.
And you all would march in the Armed Services Parade?
The Armed Services Day Parade. I marched in that every year from 1953 through 1959. 1959 was my highlight. I got to lead the whole ROTC Corps from City High down the street. Had my sponsor on my arm, had my saber, and it looked great.
Who was your sponsor?
Mickey Wade. She spelled her name M-I-C-K-E-Y.
And do you know whatever happened to her?
I think she's deceased now. She died about 3 years ago. She stayed in Chattanooga.
What were some of the things that happened to you at City High School which have made a difference in your life, Mickey?
Some of the friends I made there, and I had 2 or 3 guys I would say my best friend, and one of them was a fellow named Sam Weber. And Sam is now a ENT doctor down in Houston. And his brother, by the way, Randy Weber, a little younger, is the chief of thoracic surgery at MD Anderson. And he used to pester us when we were little kids, but he's turned out to be a star. But anyway, when I was starting my senior year at City High School, Sam came to me and he said, would you like a job on Saturday? I said, sure, what kind of job? He said, my friend Jay Silverstein owns a shop down on Market Street, 622 Market, called the Boys and Young Men's Shop, and he needs somebody to help sell clothes on Saturdays. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And Jay hired me. And Jay, without Jay, I would have never amounted to anything. He paid me $8 a Saturday. And then during the summer, he said, yeah, you can work during the summer. And I worked for Jay for 6 years. And after my first year at UC, the money was running out. And I was dating this young girl and trying to be a big fraternity man and trying to see her every night after work and after school. And finally decided I couldn't do it all, so I dropped out of school for a year. And Jay said, well, I'll let you work for this 1 year, but you got to promise that you're going to go back to school. Otherwise, you'll be sitting here in retail till you're 70 years old, and we don't want that. So he let me work for a year, and I saved my money and went back. And I remember in those days, the day after Thanksgiving, we didn't open at 4 o'clock in the morning. The day after Thanksgiving, we'd open at 9, and we'd stay open till 9. We did that 6 days a week, 72 hours a week, and he paid me $40 a week plus 1% commission. And so I was working 72 hours a week, and I never will forget in 1962, I made $87 that week, and I was just riding high. That was great stuff. But without Jay, I would have probably never amounted to anything. He was my #1 supporter. He's about 93 years old and called me about 2 weeks ago.
What are some of the other experiences you had during those years which have made, in retrospect, a big difference in who you are and what you are?
I'm not sure, Max. I think those experiences helped me learn how to deal with people. You know, when you're selling stuff and trying to deal with people every day in the retail business, you learn a lot about people. You learn a lot about yourself. I never will forget. A guy came in one day and he said, I shouldn't say this, but I will. I was standing out front. I used to smoke a lot of cigarettes, and I was standing out front. This was during the summer. We weren't very busy, and I was standing out front smoking. This guy came up and had a pair of bib overalls on and had tobacco juice running down his chin. He said, are you in Saharan or a foreign? And I said, what? He said, are you in Saharan? And I finally figured out he was asking, do you have a job? And I said, well, I'm not in charge of that department. You need to see Mr. Silverstein. I said, Mr. Silverstein, you want to speak to this young man? And Jay said, yes, sir. He said, are you in Saharan or a foreign? And Jay said, well, he said, have you ever had any experience selling clothes? He said, no, but I worked on a tater farm once. And Jay said, well, I said, we'll check back with us later.
Well, that's a good story. Tell us about Colonel Creed Bates. What sort of influence did he have on you?
Creed Bates, he was firm when he needed to be, but he could be a father figure when he needed to be. And you know, he would do things that not many other principals would do, especially for a large high school. He had a place up on Signal Mountain, and he used to raise apples and make apple cider. And he would invite some people up for apple cider, and if you got invited up to his house for that, you had arrived. And we used to have these social clubs at City High, just almost like sororities in college. We had these groups of girls' clubs called the Shipmates and the Ahoys, and in the spring we would go up to Camp Ocoee, and we'd have these senior outings and things that you just can't imagine other schools doing. And he trusted people. He trusted you until you proved that you weren't worthy of that trust, and then he could be tough. And he hired the best faculty, and the school board would just allow him to pick out the best anywhere in the whole county, and they stayed and stayed and stayed. And some of these teachers I had would stay, 40 years there, and they were just the best.
What were your favorite subjects when you were
English
there?
And history. Never was very good at math
And
or science.
Who were some of the teachers there who meant a lot to you?
Miss Patton was a Latin teacher. Miss Phelps was an English teacher. A fellow named George Blanchard. I said I wasn't very good in math, but George sort of took a liking to me and I to him, and he was a math teacher, and he and I went to church together, and he was sort of my mentor while I was at City, even though I wasn't a very good math student, but Mr. Blanchard was one of my favorites.
When did you graduate from?
1959.
What plans did you have when you graduated about what you would do next?
Well, as I said, I didn't have any money, so I knew I wasn't going off to school. I didn't think I could even afford UT, so I went to UC and continued working.
When did you start UC?
September 1959.
What were some of your early experiences as a freshman at UC?
Well, I pledged the Sigma Chi fraternity, And I thought it for a point there that first year I was majoring in fraternity. Then I met this young girl from up in Cleveland, and she and I became very, very close. She was my first real love. We broke up later, but spent a lot of time with her. Went active in the Sigma Chi fraternity in January of '60. Immediately gave Ann my pen, which was a big deal back then, we thought. I thought I was going to major in business, and I took an accounting course. And it was just basic accounting from a teacher named Rafer McLaurin. And at the end of that semester, I wound up with a grade of D, like in dad, dog, D. Never made a D in my life. And I changed my major. So thanks to Rafer McLaurin, I'm a lawyer. Without him, I would have been struggling in some kind of business.
When did you decide to go to law school?
In my senior year at UC. I was planning on either being the Army officer, infantry Army officer, or a high school English teacher. And at that time, in the Hamilton County school system, English teachers without anything but a bachelor's degree made $4,800 a year. That's $400 a month. And even then, that wasn't very good. And a second lieutenant in the Army would make about $5,600 a year. And I thought, well, that sounds a lot better. Well, my wife and I really got serious and met each other in my senior year. And my brother was in law school up at the University of Cincinnati on a Ben Wood Foundation scholarship. It provided everything in those days. And so he asked me, so why don't you apply for law school? I said, well, I don't think I want to be a lawyer. My wife said, yeah, I'd rather you be a lawyer than a teacher or an Army officer. She said, there's something called Vietnam going on or starting, and said, maybe you ought to go to law school. And I said, I don't think I can even do it. And my brother said, why don't you apply for this scholarship? And if you get the scholarship, even if you don't want to be a lawyer, it's a good education. And by the time you get out of law school, maybe Vietnam will be over. And I said, well, I'll do this. I'll apply for the scholarship, and if they're foolish enough to give it to me, I'll give law school a try. And yes, they were foolish enough and gave it to me. So I go to Cincinnati, and the first day I was there, I said, whoa, this is what I was designed to do. And I loved it from that day forward.
Did you know any lawyers before you went to law school?
Jody Baker, Charlie Goins, Landon Gammon. I got a job working as a runner for Goins, Gammon, Baker, and Robinson. Jim Robinson was a young associate then. This is before I went to law school. In the summer of 1964, my uncle, Keith Hampton, who was a pretty good Democrat politician, he was the commissioner of personnel in the Ellington and the Clement administrations for a number of years. He came to me and he said, what are you going to do this summer? I said, well, I guess I'll just sell clothes down at the boys' shop. He said, what do you make? I said, well, I've gotten a raise, now I'm up to $60 a week. He said, well, how would you like to make $125 a week? Now, this is in 1964. I said, what do I have to do, rob a bank? He said, no. He said, we want you to be the youth campaign manager for the Frank Clement for Governor campaign. I said, I don't know anything about politics. He said, you don't need to. I said, what do I do? He said, well, you just get some of your friends and put out bumper stickers, and when we go to rallies, hand out brochures, wear hats, and that sort of thing. I said, well, I can do that. And he said, well, the campaign manager is a fellow named Jody Baker. Said, he's a young lawyer in town. Said, I'll put you in touch with him. So I asked Jay Silverstein, I said, can I take a leave of absence till August? Because in those days, if you won the Democratic primary, the race was over. There weren't any Republican candidates of any stature. So I knew that come August, it'd be over. So that's where Jody and I met, and we became bosom buddies. In fact, Jody paid for my honeymoon.
I want to go back to your days at UC, and maybe this would be a good time for us to take a little break.
Okay.
Mickey, for a lawyer, eyes are pretty important, but tell us about your eyes.
Well, I've given ophthalmologists a lot of good business. I began wearing glasses when I was in my second year of law school, and then I guess about 1992, I discovered I had a cataract in this left eye, and I had it removed. And then probably 2 years later, as I was crossing the street from the parking garage going into the courthouse, all of a sudden it was like a shade came down over this left eye, and had a detached retina. And a guy named Randy Funderburk repaired that. And so the cataract and then the detached retina. And then about 12 years later, the cataract developed in the right eye, had it removed. And about a year and a half later, I had a detached retina in the right eye. And had it repaired by a fellow named John Stone. So I'm doing okay now, but my eyes are very sensitive to light. If you see me wiping, it's only because I'm tearing. And the strange thing, and I don't know anything about this, but the doctors tell me that when I tear as much as I do, it's because I have dry eyes, which sounds like oxymoron. But anyway, if I cry, I'll tell you I'm crying. If I don't tell you, you just know that it's my eyes. It all started in 1991. I went up to see a UT football game. We were opening up in August, and it was against UCLA, and it was going to be televised on ABC, and that's why they set it at 3:30 in the afternoon for the television schedule. It was 112 degrees in the stands. It was 117 on the field, and I was over on the east side of the stadium, and the sun was bearing in from the west side, and I was in Section C, which wasn't under the cover, and I sat there for 5 hours staring into that sun. And they can say what they want to, but I'm convinced that's what caused the first cataract.
Interesting.
And I'm trying to be a doctor and diagnose myself, but we won that game, by the way, 17-10.
I remember that game. I was there. I want to go back to your to college again. Did you meet your wife, Kathy, when you were at UC?
Yes, she was a year behind me, and if I had not dropped out of school for that year, I probably would have graduated before we ever got together. But I remember when she came, boy, I thought she was good looking. But she
still is.
She was a freshman when I was actually going with my other girlfriend. But I remember looking at her from afar and saying, oh, that's a pretty good looking girl. But after Ann and I broke up, by that time, Kathy had fallen in love with this guy who was a rotten lambikai. His name was Smith. So she went with him for 3 years. They broke up as she started her senior year. And by that time, I was in my senior year. And my first girlfriend and I had broken up a long time ago. And I'd been dumped by 2 or 3 others by then. And so in my senior year, a good friend of ours said, well, you both are without boy and girlfriends. Why don't we fix you up? You both like to talk a lot. You might get along. So we went in September of 1963. We went to a UC football game together, our first date. And it was love at first sight.
Well,
Now I'm crying.
and with good reason. What's Kathy's full name?
Her name was Catherine Hope Elton. And now, of course, she goes by Catherine Elton Barker, so she said, when I married you, I lost all hope.
Well, she does have a marvelous sense of humor. When was Kathy born?
She was born December 11, 1942, in Tacoma, Washington.
Well, how did she happen to get to Chattanooga?
Well, her mother, they lived in Jacksonville, but her mother had gone out to Tacoma because her father was in the Navy and he was shipping out to the Pacific. So she was out in Tacoma when Kathy was born, and then they rode the train back to Jacksonville. This could take a long time. I'll try to make it brief. Kathy was awarded a scholarship to UC. She was going with a fellow then in high school who had thought he was going to go to the University of the South at Sewanee, and at that time it was a male school only. So Kathy accepted this scholarship offer thinking Sewanee and Chattanooga are close together. So she came here not having ever seen Chattanooga or not ever having seen the school. And it turned out her boyfriend didn't go to Sewanee. He instead went to the University of Virginia. So she was here in Chattanooga and never has gone home.
What was her major?
Her major was English. After the Rayford McLaurin thing, my major sort of shifted in that direction.
Did you all have classes together?
Oh, yes. The best class we ever had together was Romantic Literature.
Did you learn some poetry to use?
Well, mine would stay in my brain about a week. She still remembers it all.
When were you married?
August 29, 1964.
And when did you graduate?
June of 64. She had planned to go to the University of Wisconsin after UC to get a master's degree in English, and why she picked Wisconsin, I don't know, but that was her plan. And I, by that time, had gotten this scholarship offer to go to the University of Cincinnati, and I said, you know, if she goes to Wisconsin and I go to Cincinnati, that relationship's going to struggle, so we don't need to do that. So I said, we just need to get married, and somehow I talked her into it. I was about 2 weeks shy of my 23rd birthday, and she was 21. She got a job at the law school library as an assistant librarian, and while she was in Cincinnati, she got her master's degree in English. She never made less than an A. Smart woman.
Well, she is a smart woman and a delightful person. But what happened to your mind in law school? Tell us about what law school did for you.
Well, I guess what you'd think you'd say is it taught me how to think like a lawyer. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I remember that was drilled in from day one. I never will forget, the first class I ever had was a torts class, and this fellow named Fred Dewey was the professor. And he came in and he said, well, I said, so all of you want to be lawyers, is that right? And I said, yeah. He said, why do you think we call it the practice of law? He said, you never really learn how to do it. You just practice the rest of your life. And he said, you think you know all the law? He said, you'll never know all the law. And I don't know, I just fell in love with it. What I learned, I think, was to learn how to define the issue in any situation. If you don't know the issue, you'll never figure out the answer.
So that was a big change.
Huge change. Huge change.
In your thinking,
yeah,
and your living.
Yeah.
What were some of the courses you most enjoyed while you were in law school?
You know, we didn't have a lot of electives until the second semester of our second year, and then we only had one or two. In our first year, I had property, I had contracts, I had torts, I had, most schools call it legal bibliography, we called it legal research. And then second year, constitutional law, which I loved. I loved torts and I loved constitutional law, and I didn't like property very much. I never will forget, in our second year I was taking basic income taxation. And we had this young professor named Gershom Goldstein who had just graduated from law school himself in Brooklyn. He was very, very bright. One of the best teachers I ever had. I never will forget that textbook or casebook that I bought. It was the most expensive book I ever bought in law school, about that thick. And even in '65, it cost like $120. So the whole semester, I was briefing all the cases, I was making outlines, and you only had the one test, you know, and at the end of the semester, I was studying my outlines and studying the cases, and two or three of my buddies said, well, we don't want to do that. And they went down to the IRS, and for 50 cents, they bought a little booklet called Your Federal Income Tax, and that's what they studied. They never looked at the case book. So when the exams were over, they got A's and I got a B. I thought $125 down the drain.
What happened during your third year in law school that influenced you particularly?
Well, I knew that I was going to the Army. The Army had given me a deferment. Excuse me, when I graduated from UC, I was commissioned as second lieutenant, and the Army gave me a deferment for 3 years to go to law school. And so I knew when I got out of law school I was going to the Army. And I also knew I was going to come back to Chattanooga to practice, and I knew what firm I was going to go with. So I sort of slacked up that last semester. And I thought, you know, I'm not going to be in a major league city very much longer. So I was a big baseball fan back then. And the Cincinnati Reds played at old Crosley Field. And I went to just about every game they had from April till school was over. And my class standing dropped about 6 places, but it was worth it.
Where did you and Kathy live when you were in
3304 Jefferson Avenue, which was a third floor walk-up, and it was about a half a mile from the college. And it was a 1-bedroom furnished apartment. It was $95 a month. And we had our grocery budget to $10 a week, and we did well. You could buy a 6-pack of Burger beer down at the IGA for 89 cents. It was good times. She was making $300 a month.
By the time you graduated from law school, did you know what sort of law you wanted to practice?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to be a litigator. I knew that from the day I went to law school. I never wanted to be a transactional lawyer.
Your dad did some work which was law related. What did your dad do?
Well, it depends on what time in his life. He did everything, Max. When my mother and father first married in 1934, neither one had finished college. They had gone to Middle Tennessee, back then it was called Middle Tennessee State Teachers College, and they spent 2 years there, and the Depression was at its height, and they both left school, and they got jobs teaching in the Marion County public school system on Suck Creek Mountain. And my father was the principal. It was a 2-room schoolhouse, and my mother taught first grade, and her best friend taught second, third. Or my mother taught 1st through 3, and her best friend taught 3 through 6, and my father was the principal, which meant he had to go down and stoke the furnace at 5 in the morning to get the place warm. Well, after that, they moved to Chattanooga. He sold insurance. He drove an ambulance. Then he drove the bus. Then after the war, he bought a liquor store, which was not good because he drank up most of his inventory. And then he got a job selling farm tractors. And then he got a job selling feed and seed. And then his last job was with the state of Tennessee as a parole and probation officer, and that was the job he had when he retired.
When was your father born?
He was born July 3rd, 1909.
And where was he born?
Powell's Crossroads, Route 3, Whitwell, they called it.
All right. So, but it was not in Whitwell, it was in Powell's Crossroads.
Right. He was one of 8 children.
Did your father and mother approve of your going into the law?
Oh, they were thrilled to death. My brother and I were the first 2 that ever graduated from college, let alone gone to a graduate school.
Tell us about your Army experience.
Well, that was fun. When I was in ROTC, in that last semester in your senior year, you had to choose a branch of the Army you wanted to go into. You had to put down 3 choices. And one of them had to be a combat arms, which meant infantry, artillery, or armor. And then the other 2, if you didn't want to be combat, you could put that down. So I'd always planned to be an infantry officer. My goal was to be a general, and I figured if you're going to be a general, you got to be in the biggest branch, and the most frontline branch. But then when I decided to go to law school and got that scholarship, I said, I don't want to be a career Army officer. So my first choice was Medical Service Corps, which is the hospital administrators. Second choice was Transportation Corps. I figured I could at least ride to battle. And then third choice was going to be armor. I could still ride to battle. Well, so I got selected for the Medical Service Corps. So I graduated in 1967 from law school. At that time, Vietnam was really heated up. And so my first order, I was going to graduate June the 15th from law school, and about June the 8th, I got this letter from the Army. It said, "Congratulations, based on your exemplary service, you have been promoted to 1st lieutenant." And I'd never even done anything after I got out of college. I was 2nd lieutenant for 3 years, never been to a meeting, never done anything, never heard from the Army. But I was 1st lieutenant. And they said, "You're to report for active duty at Fort Sam Houston, Texas on 4 September 1967. And that was for the Officer Basic School. The Medical Service Corps made up of dentists, pharmacists, people like me and others. Some had had military experience, some hadn't. And so you had to go for a 6-week course. Then it said after that, you're going to report to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where you'll be the hospital executive officer. And I figured, well, what that means is I'll be in charge of getting some private to shovel snow around the hospital for about 3 months, and they'll send me to Vietnam. And I really didn't much want to go to Vietnam, so I was trying to figure out a way out of the Vietnam deal. So when I got to Fort Sam Houston during that officer basic course, I asked around, I said, "Does anybody need any faculty members down there?" I said, "I've had ROTC all my life. I can teach these people how to read a map and how to drill and how to salute." So this fella said, yeah, I'm getting out of the Army next week. Said, come see my boss. He's looking for a replacement. This is a great story. So I go in to see this guy. His name was Frank Copeland. He was a lieutenant colonel. And he said, so why do you think you're entitled to be on this faculty? I said, well, I've had ROTC, so big deal. He said, what's your educational background? I said, well, I just got out of law. He said, are you a lawyer? I said, yeah. He said, do you know anything about divorce law? I said, well, I took a course in domestic relations. He said, have you got a law license? I said, well, I just got my law license in Tennessee a week before I left for active duty. He said, you're hired. He said, my wife's getting ready to sue me for divorce and I need in-house counsel. So I got the job as a faculty member. He got orders a month later to go to Vietnam. So I had a new boss and I was on the faculty.
Well, I was going to come back and ask you about when you took the bar exam.
Took the bar. In those days, you took it in June, and you got the results in August. And I got my results on August 12th, '67.
And you could take it before you graduated.
No, took it right after.
Right after you graduated.
I graduated, and in fact, I didn't stay in Cincinnati for the graduation ceremony. I came down to Knoxville to take the bar review course that Bob Crossley was teaching. And I stayed up there 3 weeks for the bar review course.
And then took the bar.
Then took the bar. Thanks to Bob, I passed.
Did when you were taking the bar exam, did you all? It was a multi-day experience.
Yes, and there was no multi-state. It was just all Tennessee, right. All essay.
And did people rehash what they had said after?
If they did, I wasn't there to hear it. I didn't want to hear that because I figured it'd make me more uncomfortable.
Well, you were wise because I listened to it when I took it in Virginia.
Yeah.
When did you get out of the Army?
Got out of the Army September 3, 1969. I was in for 2 years.
Where were you stationed while you were?
The whole time. Not only was I at the same Army post, I was at the same building on the same Army post from the day I walked in till I walked out.
That's remarkable.
Oh, I felt a little guilty because I had a lot of friends who were going to Vietnam, many of whom didn't come back, and many of whom came back in bad shape. And I was on active duty, and as a faculty member, I was at the school teaching during the day. In the afternoon, they had a 27-hole golf course, and some of my buddies in the Army and I decided to take up golf. And I thought, this is the garden spot of the Army in the middle of a war. There's something unfair about that.
Who were you teaching?
I was teaching all the incoming doctors. In those days, doctors were subject to the draft. And I was teaching the doctors. I was teaching all the incoming nurses. I was teaching the other MSC. I taught things like military courtesy, map reading, how to fire an M16 rifle. I ran the infiltration course out at our field training place. It was general subjects, they called it.
Off the record. About to Mick, it must have been quite an experience teaching men like doctors who had absolutely no experience with the military how to be soldiers when they came straight from being drafted to your good hands as a teacher. Tell us an experience or two you had.
Well, a lot of those doctors, in fact, most of those doctors, when they would finish their 6 weeks officer basic course, most of them would wind up in their 2-year tour, at least spending one of those 2 years in Vietnam. So a lot of them were concerned about Vietnam, and the training they went through in medical school didn't prepare them for a lot of the things that they would see in the way of traumatic injury. So a lot of it was very serious and very touching, but some of it was funny. For example, when they would come on active duty, the first 3 days they would come in civilian clothes, and we would teach them classes about, how to buy their uniforms and where to buy them and what they're supposed to wear. And so the 4th day they were supposed to show up in uniform. And so, and I was just a little first lieutenant and had one little silver bar, and they all had at least 2 silver bars or perhaps even a gold leaf as a major. So the 4th day, I'm wandering around the campus, we would call it, and I saw this young student, and he had his new uniform on, and he had about 6 rows of ribbons. I mean, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Meritorious. And I walked up to him and I said, "Captain," I said, "where did you get that uniform?" He said, "Over at the PX." And I said, "What made you decide to put all these ribbons?" He said, "Well, I saw other guys with them on. I thought it sort of dressed up the uniform." And I said, "You have to earn those for their awards. You don't buy them and put them on." Then some of them show up with their caps on backwards.
What did you learn during those 2 years you were teaching people how to get into the military and behave?
I don't know that I learned a lot. I learned a lot about weaponry. I learned how M60 machine guns work. I learned how M14, M16 rifles work. I did learn how to teach. That was one of my goals. I said earlier, maybe I wanted to have been an English teacher, a high school English teacher. Teaching's always been one of my loves, and I loved that job. And I still like teaching. And I thought I developed my teaching skills to a pretty good extent.
When you were discharged from the Army, you were going to go into law practice, and you said something earlier about knowing where you were going to go and what you were going to do.
Yeah.
When you graduated from law school, of course, the world was available to you. Why did you decide to come back to Chattanooga?
Well, I thought a little bit about staying in Cincinnati. I really liked Cincinnati, but I don't know where the accent changes. Maybe it's at the Ohio River, but my accent was a Southern accent, and there's a Midwestern accent, and I thought that might be a drawback. Plus, I just always had thought that I would come back to Chattanooga, so I never seriously gave it much thought about staying anywhere but here. And you asked earlier if my parents, what they thought about going to law school. My father was particularly excited. He said, "I'm going to have a son. It'll be in Chattanooga as a lawyer." My oldest son's already a lawyer. And the State Department of Parole and Probation offices were right down the hall in the old Title Guarantee and Trust building, the 2nd floor, Charlie Hahn's old building. They were down at the end of the hall from the Dietzen, then it was Dietzen Parks and Dietzen law firm. And my father and Bill and Richard Dietzen's father, Buck Dietzen, were pretty good buddies. One of the reasons they were buddies, they liked to take a little drink every afternoon, and they would sit around and pontificate. So my daddy said, "Son, I've got you a job." Said, "The Dietzens want to hire you." And so I remember I was home one weekend and went in and talked to them. And they said, "Well, all else being equal, when you get out of the Army, come see us, we'll give you a job." And they said, "We don't know for sure 2 years from now, but we think we'll give you a job." And so my father, I think, sort of had me a job. And I remember I didn't know whether I wanted to be a plaintiff's lawyer or a defense lawyer. Back in those days, you couldn't really do both in Chattanooga. Not many people could. You could, but not many of us could. And I remember I was interviewed with the old Thomas Leitner Mann and Milburn firm, and they offered me a job. Roberts, Weil, and Ellis, Harry Weil offered me a job. Then it was Witt, Gaither, and Abernathy offered me a job. And I got to thinking, I think I'd really rather have my client sitting across the table from me rather than some claims guy that I got to talk to on the phone. And so I think I'd rather just be a general practitioner and represent real live people. And so the Dietzen firm just seemed like the place I ought to go. And that's where I went.
Tell us about the Dietzen firm.
Well, when I went in, it was called Dietzen, Parks and Dietzen. It was a very small firm. There was Jess Parks, there was Richard Dietzen, there was Bill Dietzen, and there was this older man who was a sweet, dear man who just was always an associate. His name was Forrest Hudson, and me. And the senior partner, Buck Dietzen, his name was Walter Nicholas Dietzen, but he went by Buck. He had practiced law for, I guess, since about 1931, and he had become a General Sessions judge by then, so he was right straight across the street in the courthouse, so it was just the 5 of us there together.
Who were some of the other people who eventually practiced with that firm, and what became of them?
Well, you know, you and I talked about this earlier today, and I think I'm right when I say this. That small little firm, I think, produced more Tennessee judges than any other law firm in the state of Tennessee. Ray Brock, he was a chancellor in Hamilton County and then became a Supreme Court justice in 1974. He was a member of that firm. I was a member of that firm. A fellow named Forrest Hudson that I told you about earlier, he became a Chattanooga City judge. Jess Parks, who was a member of that firm, became a Chattanooga City judge and later a Hamilton County Circuit judge. Frank Brown, who is now a chancellor here in Chattanooga, Hamilton County, was a member of that firm. About the only two who never became judges were Bill Dietzen and Richard Dietzen. But the rest of us, somehow or another, all became members of the judiciary. And I think that may be some record, especially for just a 5-member firm.
Yes, when you told me about that, I was surprised. I didn't.
Well, there's a firm over
that.
in Jackson that may have come close. That'd be the Hewitt Tomlin firm with David Farmer and that group. They produced a good number of judges.
What about Waldrop and Hall?
I hate to tell you, but I'm not familiar with that firm.
Well, do you remember your first client or one of the early people you had sitting down on the other side of the table?
Yeah, you remember I told you my father was a probation and parole officer for the state, and his office was down the hall from our offices. And he used to send me all the clients he could, you know, these guys who were getting divorces or had trouble paying their bills. So one day this character walked in. He was about 28 years old, about my age. And he said, "Your father sent me down to see." He said, "I need a lawyer." And I said, "Well, great. What do you need?" He said, "Well," he said, "I'm on probation, parole now for a burglary." He said, "But I've done my time and I'm going straight." He said, "As a matter of fact, I have the franchise with the Red Ball Moving and Storage Company." He said, "I'm going to be their local operator." And he said, "I've rented a warehouse out on 11th Street and I want to open up a business and I want to incorporate." And I said, "Well, I can do that." And he said, "Well, I want to name the company the Cherokee Moving and Storage Company." And I said, "We'll do that." So he said, "What is it going to cost me?" And I told him. And he said, "Well, here's my proposition." He said, "You and I are both starting out in business. We neither one have much money." He said, "Would you consider being the firm's lawyer?" And he said, "I'll give you 10% of the stock in the company. If we make some money, you'll get 10%. If we don't, you know, you're out 10%. And he said, "It'll be a chance for us both to," and I did something I should have never done. And I decided I'd go in business with the clients. So I incorporated the business, issued him 90% of the stock. I took 10%. About 10 days later, I'm in my office and the phone rings. And the secretary said, "Mr. Jim Waterhouse is on the phone." Well, I didn't know Jim Waterhouse, but I knew who he was. He was at a big law firm called Miller, Martin, Hitchings, Tipton, Linehan, and Waterhouse. They've shortened the name now to Miller Martin. So I answered the phone, and he said, "Mr. Barker," he said, "my name's Jim Waterhouse. I'm an attorney," and told me the firm. And he said, "Do you represent a company called Cherokee Moving and Storage Company?" I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And he said, "Well, I represent another company called Cherokee Warehouses." He said, "We've been in business for a number of years, and there's some confusion among the public." And he said, "Some of the customers for Cherokee Warehouses are now calling Cherokee Moving and Storage. And I'm just here to tell you that we want your company to change its name, or there may have to be litigation." And I said, "Well, I'll just get back to you in a few minutes, Mr. Waterhouse." So I called up my client. His name was Kenneth Butler. And I said, "Ken, we've got a problem here. We're going to have to change the name." He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, there's another company that's been around for a long time named Cherokee Warehouses, and we're infringing on their name, and there's going to be some litigation." He said, "Well, let us sue. Let them sue." I said, "I got a lawyer." I said, "Whoa." I said, "No, you don't." So I got out of that really quickly.
Well, whatever became of that case?
Well, it didn't get filed because about 2 weeks later, a woman accused him of stealing her washer and dryer that she had storage out there. So the business just sort of went out. But never, ever go into business with your client.
That is a great, great rule. What do you remember from some of your other early experiences in practicing law?
Well, I guess in a fairly true sense, we were general practitioners. You know, we handled some divorces, we handled some criminal cases, we handled, particularly Richard Dietzen did a lot of estate practice. We handled a lot of plaintiff's personal injury cases, will contests, just pretty much anything that walked in the door. And I remember going over to General Sessions Court. Let me tell you about the first jury trial I had. Jess Parks was one of the senior partners in the firm, and he was representing a lady who had had an automobile accident out in Tiftonia on Cummings Highway, which is US Highway 11. And she was going in one direction on Cummings Highway, which is a 4-lane road, and decided to make a left turn into this business to do some kind of transaction, and turned pretty much in front of a fellow going the other way. But she had been a client in years past, and so Jess Parks took her case and filed a lawsuit on her behalf as plaintiff, when she's the one who turned left in front of the other fellow. So it was on a Wednesday night, and I was getting ready to leave the office, and Jess said, "Come in here and let me ask you something." I said, "What?" He said, "What are you going to do tomorrow?" I said, "Well, I've got some research that I was going to do." He said, "Why don't you go over to the courthouse and help me try this case?" He said, "It's a simple case." He said, "It's in front of Judge Hunter." And he said, "Show up tomorrow morning." I said, "What is it?" He said, "You don't need to know." He said, "Just come on in here tomorrow morning. I'll introduce you to the client. We'll go there together." So we go to the courthouse, and we get there, and Charlie Goins was representing the insured, the defendant. And we get there, and we're ready to start the case. And Jess says to me, "I need to go down to the county clerk's office just a few minutes to," he picked the jury, and he said, "I've got to step down there to check the license plate on the defendant's car to make sure it was his car." He said, "You get up and read the declaration." You remember those days?
I do.
You read the declaration, that was your opening statement, and they would read the answer, and they'd say the issues are joined and all. So he said, "You read the declaration, by the time you finish, I'll be back." So I got up, not knowing the client or not knowing anything, and I read the declaration. And when I finished, Charlie got up and read his answer, and then Judge Hunter said, "Call your first witness." And I looked around, and there's no Jess Parks. And I said, "Your Honor, Mr. Parks will be back." He said, "I said, call your first witness." I didn't know this, but Judge Hunter was in on all this. And so was the client. And Jess had told the client, said, "There's no way you can win this case unless the jury feels sorry for your lawyer." And so we're going to put him in, throw him. So I put her on the witness stand. I said, "Tell me about it." And I wanted to know just like the jury. Well, when the case was over and the jury went out, she looked over at me. She said, "Mr. Barker, you did pretty well." Said, "I knew that I didn't have a chance, but Mr. Parks said this would be a good one for you to start on." Well, the jury had been out about an hour and a half, and I got thinking, hey, I may win this case. And I didn't. They came in and said judgment for defendant, and she thanked me, and that was it. And I go back over to the office. It's about 5 in the afternoon, and Jess Parks is back in the back room having a drink of whiskey with Buck and my father.
Well, what did he say then, and what did you say?
He said, "If I had told you that you were going to try the case, you would have stayed up all night worrying about it, and it wasn't worth that. So I just thought you ought to go ahead and do it." And I'd already tried a couple of General Sessions Court cases, but not a jury case.
What did Judge Hunter say about it, or did you ever talk with Judge Hunter
He said,
about
"Son," he said, "you did pretty well, but you got a long way to go."
I really enjoyed him. He was a great judge. a lot of wonderful stories about him.
Yep.
Were you on a salary or a draw, or
When I first started, my salary was $600 a month, and after about 3 months, Wilma Dietzen, Bill's wife, I think made Bill feel guilty, and so she said, "You need to give that boy a raise." So they moved it up to $675 a month, plus a third of whatever business I brought in. And my father was sending me all those crooks that he could, and so in the end of the first year, I made $11,200.
Well, that's remarkable. Did y'all ever talk when you were in law school about what you might be making when you got out?
My brother graduated 3 years ahead of me, and when he came back to Chattanooga, he started out at $300 a month. So in that 3-year period, salaries had gone up. They had doubled to $600.
Yeah, I was with the firm he started with.
Well, he told me it's $300. He may not have told
No,
me.
that's exactly right. That's what it was then. What were some of your other early experiences, Mickey, and as you began to get your feet on the ground?
Well, Jess Parks, the lawyer I'm telling you about, was during the war, he had been with the FBI, And he had learned tremendously great investigative skills. And I used to go with him. He would investigate every case, every case he had. He would go out to the scene, he'd talk to and he taught me to, you got to be a master of the facts. You can't allow any case to have a surprise as best you can prevent it. And so he taught me a lot about investigation and how to get statements. And he said one time, he said, there's two ways to learn as you're starting out. You can either spend a lot of time doing the research yourself, or else you can call somebody else who's already done it. And he said, as between the two, I suggest you call somebody who's already been there and get their advice. And I learned a lot by doing it. They gave me a lot of responsibility, much more than I deserved. But I had a lot of responsibility from the first day.
Well, Jess was a distinguished person.
Yeah.
Just in the way he looked and the way he acted. And I'm sure he was a good teacher in many ways. What did you learn about bringing in business from the firm?
In the kind of firm I was in, you have to bring in your business. None of it's handed to you. And so, I guess I used some of my old skills from selling clothes to try to deal with people. And I had a lot of friends in town that would send me some business, college friends and others. As I said, my father was sending some business. And I still believe this, that the best way to get business is by having satisfied clients. I've never been a believer in advertising. Still not a believer in advertising. And I always thought the best way to get business is by having a reputation of dealing fairly and honestly and effectively with the clients you have. And if you do that, they'll send you some other clients.
Can you give us any anecdotal experience you have or remember about another client sending you somebody else?
Not offhand, I can't. Well, I can, but it's a long story. It's about the time I let a statute of limitations run. There was a couple came in to see me, and I should have never taken their case. They were pretty well homeless, and they lived in a cheap motel. It was called the City Motel, right over Nicky's restaurant on the side of the hill. Paul Carrico has his dental office there now. It was an old cheap motel, and that was their home. And the place burned, and they came in to see me, and they said, the place burned because the electrical wiring was awful, and we'd been complaining for months, and the owner wouldn't do anything about it, and we lost all of our belongings. And they didn't have much in the way of belongings except the clothing on their back. And they said, so we want to sue him. And foolishly, I agreed to take the case. And in those days, you had to just file a civil warrant in the General Sessions Court. And I think the jurisdiction was $3,000. So I filed a suit for $3,000. I thought I'd filed a suit. And what we would do in our office, perhaps it wasn't a good practice, but we would fill out the civil warrant, and our secretary would type it as a long thing on a legal form. And it was a $10 filing fee, and she'd draw a check for $10, and then she would hand me the file, and there'd be a paper clip with the warrant and the check there for me to go file it. And I had not heard from my clients for about a year and a half, and they had waited a year and a half after the fire. It was a 3-year statute because it was property damage. One night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I waked up and I just sat in bed. I said, and I'd never even thought about this case for over a year. And I said, why hasn't something happened on that? So I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, went down to the office, and opened up my drawer, and somehow I'd put the file in there and never filed the warrant, and the paper clip and all had gotten inside the file, and I panicked. I said, the lawsuit's over with. So I said, I got to get these clients in here. So I called and finally found, they had broken up by then. One was living on Sand Mountain, Alabama, the husband, and the wife was living with a sister in Sale Creek, but I somehow got in touch with them. And I said, I've got some developments on your case, and I want you to come in. So they agreed to come in, even though they weren't speaking to each other. One was on one side of the waiting room, one on the other, and I called them back to the office. And I said, I think we can get your case settled today. I said, what would you take to settle it? They said, well, $3,000. I said, well, you realize that my fee was going to be a third, so that would give you $2,000. I said, is that what you want? They said, yes. I said, we can settle it right now. And they said, great. I said, but I need to tell you something. We're not settling against the guy that owned the motel. It's me. I said, I'm your lawyer, and I messed up. And I told him what happened. I said, you don't have to accept this money. I said, you're free to go get some other lawyer or on your own and sue me because I messed up. And they said, no, we just take your $2,000. I said, I thought you would. And so I wrote them out a check, $1,000 apiece. That very night, the husband went on Sand Mountain and got drunk, I guess on some of that money, and ran his car off the road and killed himself. The wife went out and she, I guess, saved her money. About 2 weeks later, she sent me her first cousin in a personal injury case, and I settled it for $80,000. And that was a case I'd let a statute run on.
That's a remarkable case, but you handled it the way a lawyer has to handle those things.
It scared me to death.
Well, we could all tell stories like that. When we got up in the middle of the night and pulled on some breeches over pajamas and came to the office.
Well, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I let a statute run, but I sure did. That was the one and only time.
It happens. It happened to me one time.
Yeah.
But it was a different sort of thing, and eventually we got it straightened out with the client. But how many years did you practice before you started thinking about wanting to go on the bench?
I probably had been practicing about 7 years, and I got to thinking, someday I'd like to be a judge. But I knew it wasn't the time to do it.
Why?
I love the law, and I love the rigors, the intellectual rigors. But there were a lot of times that I wasn't happy in the practice. And I shouldn't say this, but out of 10 cases I would enjoy maybe 2 out of 10. And some of the others were drudgery. Some of the cases I made some of the biggest fees on were the ones where my clients were the easiest to get along with, and some that were the hardest to ever get resolved. I had some unreasonable clients. I used to have divorced women that would call me at 6:15 on Sunday nights at home. And they'd say, Mr. Barker, my husband's supposed to have the children back at 6. It's 6:15, they're not here. I want him put in jail. And things like that just began to bother me. And I thought, I really like to be involved, but not having to advocate sometimes for positions I'm really not that happy with. I shouldn't say that either, but that was the thinking.
Well, it's always the client's case. It's never our case as lawyers.
That's right. That's right.
When did you first go on the bench?
June the 27th, 1983.
You are remarkable in many ways, but one thing which is remarkable about your career is that you have sat on 3 different benches in 3 levels of Tennessee court system.
But Al Birch holds the record. He sat on all 4 levels: Sessions Court, Trial Court, Intermediate Court, and Supreme Court.
And he just died earlier this year.
Died in August. One of my dearest friends.
Great man.
Yeah.
Well, tell us about your first going on the bench, how that happened.
Judge Frank Wilson, our district judge here for the federal district, died in September of 1982. And of course, there were a lot of people who wanted to be considered as his replacement. One of them was Judge Ted Milburn, who was a circuit judge here in Chattanooga. And he was notified by President Reagan that he would get the appointment, and that would have been in probably April of maybe March. He had to go through the Senate confirmation, which wasn't a big deal. But anyway, he knew probably by about the middle of April at the latest that he was going to be the new federal district judge. So I knew that there was going to be a vacancy there. And so I started trying to make a few moves and contact some people about the possibility of being considered by Governor Alexander for that appointment. So Judge Milburn I guess his investiture took place on Friday, June the 24th, 1983, and I'd already received word that I was going to be his successor, so I took the bench the following morning, Monday morning. But interestingly, Judge Milburn called me about 3 weeks earlier, and he said, look, I'm getting ready for my move to federal court, and I've got this trial coming up with Charlie Gerhauser, Paul Leitner, and some other lawyers. And he said, it's going to take a couple of weeks to try. He said, would you be willing to come in early as special judge to start the case, and you'll be on the bench formally by the time it's over. And I said, I don't really think I ought to do. Oh, please do that. He said, I've got my mind on other things. I said, okay. So I went up, and that was my first jury trial to preside over, and it was about a 2-week trial. Major case. Had lawyers from Atlanta, from all over the country. The plaintiff was suing, in essence, 400 insurance companies, and I managed my way through that. That was my first trial. It was sort of like my first jury trial.
When were you sworn in?
I was sworn in Monday morning, June the 27th, 1983.
Who swore you in?
Wilkes T. Thrasher. And Gus Wood, my old high school roommate, who was then Commissioner of Safety, came over here and brought the commission.
Had you been active in politics?
Yes. I started out, working for Frank Clement as a Democrat. There weren't many Republicans then. Bill Brock had just won a seat in Congress a year or two before. No, that was the same year, 64. So he sort of resurrected the Republican Party. So I started out in the Democratic Party. I was the treasurer of the Young Democrats of Tennessee. Then I went off to law school, and my politics began to change. To be honest, I wasn't all that excited over Lyndon Baines Johnson. And I thought, the Democrats in Washington are not like the Democrats in Tennessee. So when I came home, I said, I'm not going to be involved in politics. I've got a young family. And a fellow named Gene Hunt called me one day. He said, why don't we have lunch? And I just he was an assistant for Bill Brock, who was in the Senate then. And he called and asked me to lunch and asked me if I'd be willing to do something. And I said, well, I guess so. The Democrats haven't asked me. I just sort of wound up being involved in Republican politics. I became precinct chairman, 3rd District finance director for Ronald Reagan when he ran. And then I had run for a circuit judgeship in 1982. I'd lost. I did a foolish thing. I decided to run against a 23-year incumbent. I made a decent race, but he beat me. And
who was that?
That was Tom Walker.
David Tom Walker.
And so the next, when the vacancy came up after the death of Judge Wilson, I guess the governor thought, well, he did a decent job and expressed an interest. And so I had some other people like Bill Brock's brother, Pat Brock, and Tom Garrity, and some other well-known local Republicans who wrote one single letter, and all of them signed it, and I think that did the trick.
Did you know the governor then?
Yes.
How had you known Governor Alexander?
Well, there was a fellow in Memphis named Harold Sterling who was going to run for governor, and he ran for governor in a Republican primary the first time Governor Alexander ran, and I became the Hamilton County, I was talked into that. I became the Hamilton County manager for Harold Sterling, and as soon as the day after the primary, when he was defeated decisively, Governor Alexander came over, and so I met him in front of the Reed House, and we had our picture taken, all coming together. And so I joined ranks and closed ranks, and then I became a big supporter of Lamar Alexander.
Did you talk to Governor Alexander about your interest in the bench?
Yes. Yeah. When it looked like I was down with one other candidate for this appointment in '83, Governor Alexander's office called and said, would you come over to Nashville and come out to the mansion and meet with the governor? And I went out there that morning, and he came in, and I'll never forget, he was wearing an old plaid shirt, bedroom slippers, and a pair of wrinkled khaki pants. So we sat in that little library there, and I know it's still there since it's been remodeled, but it's a little small room. And the only question he asked me, he said, if I appoint you, will you promise you'll be a good judge? And I said, I'll do my best. He said, well, he said, judges have a way of hanging around a lot longer than governors. And he said, so you may be around a while if you get the job. And he said, you're not going to embarrass me, are you? I said, I don't think I will. And he said, okay, I'll give you the job. He said, don't tell anybody, though, because I've got to call this other candidate and tell him I've made a different decision, and I don't want the word to get out until I make the call. And I said, that's fine. Bill Koch, by the way, was then the governor's lawyer. And when I came back home, I didn't tell anybody except my wife. And about a week later, I got a call from a young man I didn't know. He said, Mr. Barker, he said, my name is Bill Koch. He said, I'm counsel to Governor Alexander. He said, I understand that people in Chattanooga are already hearing you've got the appointment. I said, well, they haven't heard it from me. He said, we're getting all this feedback. I said, well, he called the other fellow to tell him he didn't get it. And I said, I guess if it came from anybody, it would have come from him. He said, well, I just want you to know the governor hadn't really made it official yet. And I said, well, if it'll make you feel better, I said, I'll pack up my family. We'll take off to Florida for a week and be out of town. He said, that might be a good idea. And the ironic thing is later, Bill Koch and I served on the Supreme Court together. And when he was being sworn in 2006, we were in the old Supreme Court building, and he wanted me to say a few words on his behalf. So I got up before he was sworn in, and I said, by the way, Mr. Koch, I want you to know the governor has not appointed you yet. We became bosom buddies, but at that point, he scared me to death. I'm crying, not crying, I'm tearing.
After you tried that first case, which you began before you were officially sworn in as the circuit judge, how did you learn to be a judge?
You know, in the United States, judges learn just on the job. In Europe, you go to school to become a judge, but that's not so in the United States. Some people never learn. I hope I learned. I learned, I think, by looking at what other judges had done. I thought Frank Wilson was the absolute epitome of what a fine judge ought to be. I had a big thing I put on my desk, a big sign. Nobody saw it but me, but it was down glued to my desk. It said, patience. And, you know, I tried to learn to be courteous, and sometimes that's hard. I tried to make sure that everybody got to have their say in court. I'd seen a lot of judges who would cut people off. And so, well, I've heard that before. Well, I tried to remember every lawsuit was important to that client. It may be not important to anybody else, but to that client, that's their only case. And I tried to every day keep saying to myself, remember, be patient, be courteous, and listen to the witnesses. And I guess I just learned by doing.
Was that before the Judicial College had been established?
No, I went in 1983. At that time, Justice Cooper was the chief, and I had asked if they would give me the opportunity to go to the Judicial College out in Reno, and he said, I don't think you need to go till you've been around at least 2 years. So I went out in 1985 for a 3-week course, general jurisdiction course. It was a fabulous course.
Do you think that was wise to wait for 2 years before you went?
Yes.
Why?
Because you need to know what the language is. You need to know what the problems that judges face, common problems around the state, around the country. You need to have enough experience so you can be engaged in the discussions. And yeah, I think it was a real wise thing. I'm not sure they're still doing it. I'm not sure there's even the money to send people out as often as we used to.
Well, the college is still going.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I went out there about a year before I retired for a course on independent judiciary.
Quite an issue.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything from other judges besides Judge Wilson, before whom I'm sure you tried cases?
Did I learn anything about Judge Wilson?
No, from other judges other than Judge Wilson, which was particularly helpful.
Well, I thought another judge that was a local judge that was just tremendous temperament, intellect, and courteous was Joe DiRizio, criminal court judge. I knew him before he became a judge. In fact, I had a little something to do with him deciding to run. I thought he was just a great judge. The way he would handle himself in the courtroom, never raised his voice. You know, I tried to take my work very seriously, but I never took myself seriously. You know, to me, you need to have a little fun in life. But on the bench, I was really, really serious, because it's a serious business, no matter what kind of case it is.
How did your life change after you went on the bench?
You know, I'd always heard when you go from being a lawyer to a judge, your life changes because suddenly you're distance from your friends. I didn't experience that much. I worked at trying to be the same guy I'd always been, still work at it. For example, Jerry Summers, one of my closest friends since high school, he had a case in front of me, and he was the first case he ever tried in front of me, and maybe the only case he ever tried in front of me. I excluded 107 of his proposed exhibits. And I used to say, you can cuss me for 3 days. After that, it's personal.
Well, when you sit as a judge, you are going to be sitting on cases where you know not only the lawyers, but parties. How did you decide whether or not you ought to recuse yourself?
Well, I didn't get that issue that often, but Judge Wilson used to say, the appearance of justice is just as important as justice itself. If a case is decided properly, but the litigants don't believe that, then justice really hasn't been done. So if I thought there was any issue, any question that I might reasonably be challenged, or people might reasonably think that there was some hanky-panky or some friendship, I would get off. I wouldn't even wait on a motion for recusal. But by the same token, I wouldn't grant a recusal motion because they just wanted to judge shop. But if I knew somebody or knew something about somebody that in my mind thought, even maybe subconsciously might sway me, I wouldn't hear the case.
Well, it's one of those difficult issues which face judges, and being a judge is difficult. What, to you, were some of the most difficult things you faced just being a judge? When I was on the Supreme Court and on the Court of Criminal Appeals, we heard a lot of death penalty cases, a lot. And one of the most difficult cases was the first execution that we had, a fellow named Robert Glenn Coe. He had been convicted 22 years earlier for a murder of a little 8-year-old girl over in West Tennessee, and he'd been on death row for those many number of years, and there'd been all sorts of appeals and federal system, post-convictions, competency hearings, and finally it came time for the execution to occur. And in Tennessee, we just set a date. We don't set a time. That's up to the warden out at Riverbend. And so we would set a date, and they typically would have the execution at 1 a.m. And I really don't think that's a good idea, but that was their thinking. Their thinking was, well, that may keep onlookers and the public away. And if it doesn't occur then, we still got 23 hours within which to perform the execution before that date ends. And so this was a new thing for all of us. All members of the court had never been to experience an actual execution. And so we said there'd be some last-minute filings, so we had about 6 staff attorneys there in Nashville. We were all present in Nashville. We were going to stay up until we got word that it was over or that somebody had stopped it or we had done something. And so finally, at about 10 minutes till 1 in the morning, Riley Anderson, who was then our chief, said, I'm going to call the warden and tell him to proceed with the execution. And that was tough. But I'll tell you, another tough decision was all the custody cases I had through the years as a trial judge. I would go home at night and pray. Judge, God, have I done the right thing? That tears me up. When you think you're taking somebody's kid away from them, or you're moving somebody, that's tough. Mm-hmm. But, you have to do it. What were some of the other things you found which you hadn't expected when you went on the bench being difficult, part of the responsibility?
As a trial judge, I don't know of anything else, Max. Because I'd been up there trying a lot of cases, and I kind of knew what to expect. If you're a judge in a town like Chattanooga, still a small town, you know all the lawyers that come to court. You know the ones you can trust. You know the ones whose word you take with a grain of salt. You know the ones who are going to be prompt. You know the ones who are going to be involved in trying to have delays. You know the ones who are going to give you good material to work with, the ones who are not going to get prepared. And so I knew all of that. Still do.
What were your pleasures on the bench, on the trial bench now? Let's talk about that, not Court of Appeals or Supreme Court.
My pleasures were having good lawyers in interesting cases and having the case tried well and having some intellectual workouts. That was the pleasure. You know, the tough cases are the ones I liked. You know, the little rear enders where there's no nothing to work with, that wasn't near as exciting as trying to come up with some real good instructions. Like the auditing malpractice you tried, that was a challenge. Unfortunately, the Court of Appeals got it wrong and said I need to be reversed.
Well, those things, that's part of the practice. What about working with juries? How did you find that?
I loved it. I loved it. I never will forget one time I was trying this case, and it was a simple rear ender, and Don Warner was representing the defense. And so it was right after lunch, and it was during the summer, and Don decided he wanted to read this doctor's deposition. And so he got on the witness stand, he starts reading the deposition, and one of the jurors on the back row started nodding off. And so Don, when he got through, I said, call your next witness, and he looked over and he said, Judge, may I approach the bench? I said, yes. He said, there's a witness, or there's a juror on the back row who's gone to sleep. Would you wake him up? I said, why don't you wake him up? You're the one who put him to sleep. Don didn't know what I said, no, I'll take it. So I said, okay, ladies and gentlemen, I said, it's warm this afternoon. Why don't we all stand up and take a little stretch break in place? But Don... But you know, the thing, you asked me about juries. Juries oftentimes see things the judge doesn't see and the lawyers don't see. And you know, sometimes you disagree with the jury's verdict, but by and large, they get it right. And it's just amazing to me that in England, where we got our jury system from, they have largely abandoned the use of juries because they say it's time consuming, it's not efficient, but boy, I like juries.
What about working with the court staff as when you were on the trial bench?
Well, I inherited a secretary from Ted Milburn, Barbara Osborne, and she was with me while I was on the trial court, went with me to the Court of Criminal Appeals, went with me to the Supreme Court, and I wore her out and she finally retired, but we're still close friends. She was with me for 25 years. My clerk that was assigned to our court was Sherry Rumfeld, who's now Sherry Ralston. She was great. That whole clerk's office was very efficient and helpful. And, you know, I enjoyed all my time as a judge, but I suspect if I had to pin down one that was my favorite, it was the trial court. You see the witnesses, you see the jury, you see the litigants, you see the lawyers in action. You have to rule. You don't have to have a committee rule. You make your own decisions as you go, and I just loved it.
I think that is why Judge Wilson never followed up on the opportunities he had to go on the Sixth Circuit bench.
Yeah.
Why did you want to go to the Court of Criminal Appeals?
Penny White had just left the Court of Criminal Appeals and been appointed to the Supreme Court, and my friend Jerry Summers called me, and he said, there's an opening on the Court of Criminal Appeals. He said, you need to apply for it. I said, well, I haven't even been involved in any criminal law since I went on the bench in '83. And I said, in '89, the whole criminal code was changed, so I don't know anything about the criminal law. He said, well, he said, you're a good Republican, and you've got a good Republican governor coming in, Don Sundquist. He said, you ought to try for it. And I said, I don't think so. And I went home that night, and I got to thinking about it. I said, you know, I think it's sort of like the old 1943 musical Oklahoma. There's a song in there about Kansas City, and they say you've gone about as far as they can go. And I said, you know, I've gone about as far as I can go here, and I need to, if I'm going to ever stay fresh, I need to learn something new. So I said, I'll just give it a whirl. So I applied for it, and they foolishly gave it to me. And I spent that first year relearning the criminal law, and I loved it.
I wouldn't agree with the foolish part, but what did you find most challenging, aside from
learning the criminal law over again?
Yeah, well, just most challenging being a judge on the Court of Criminal Appeals, which you're dealing with a whole different segment of
Well, when I first went on the Court
society.
of Criminal Appeals, there were only 9 of us. And about a year later, they enlarged the court to 12, so we had 4 from each grand division. But it was an integrated court. Unlike the Court of Appeals, we would rotate so that I might be in Jackson one month, and the next month in Nashville, and the next month, and I would be sitting with all the different judges. And we had a tremendous workload. You know, there was no such thing really as mediation in criminal cases, so they all got tried, and everyone who was convicted wanted to appeal, and they had under Rule 3 an automatic right to appeal. So we were literally having to write 110 to 120 opinions a year, and you just had to crank them out. And I never will forget one of the judges, in fact, it was John Byers. He said, I was asked one time what this job is like, and I said, it's like writing 100-term papers a year. And he said, we're just grading papers. And the hard part for me was having to learn how to crank out that many opinions a year and have some degree of confidence that I was doing it right. And I will say this, the members of that court were some of the finest, best people I've ever worked with. All of those judges were just top notch.
What do you think about mixing of the judges from the East and the Middle and the West?
I loved it. It kept us fresh. And I've criticized the Court of Appeals for not being an integrated court. I think you can sometimes fall into a rut if you're all the same thinking all the time. We sort of had a little bit of that on the Supreme Court, but the issues were sometimes so unusual that you didn't know exactly how it might come out because of the new issue. But I love moving around the state.
After you heard argument in a case, when you were in the Court of Criminal Appeals, did you all have a conference?
Yes.
And how did you handle disagreements?
Well, let me back up just a little bit. But I don't think a lot of people know this, and I don't know whether it's changed or not, but I never will forget when I first went on my first sitting on the Court of Criminal Appeals. Paul Summers was the senior person on the court, so he was going to be the presiding judge. And we walked into the robing room before court, and he took 3 little pieces of paper, and he wrote down 1, 2, 3 on each one of them, wadded them up, and threw them on the desk, said, Mickey, you pick one. And I picked one, and it said 2. And then I forget who the other person was. He picked one and said 1, and Paul picked one and said 3. And I said, what does all that mean? He said, that means that you're going to get the second case that's argued, and I'm going to get the third case, and he's going to get the first case. And I like that because you didn't know when you went into court who was going to be assigned the case. So you all had to be prepared. You know, some courts, they know in advance who's going to get the case, and so you might see some judge sleeping almost because they know they don't have to write the opinion. And that didn't happen on the Court of Criminal or the Supreme Court. And so immediately after court, both on the Court of Criminal Appeals and on the Supreme Court, as soon as court's over for that day, we would go back in the robing room, just the members of the court, no clerks, no staff, no nobody, and we would for the first time discuss the case and come up with a tentative decision. Each person would say what they think. And then the presiding judge on the Court of Appeals would say, you go ahead and write the case because that's the one you've been assigned by the draw. And on the Supreme Court, the chief, or whoever the chief was, would assign the opinion and responsibility to some member of the court. And then then on the Supreme Court, we used to have an internal rule that said all opinions have to be circulated within 6 months from the date of argument. We were pretty good. We would get ours out in the old days when I was still there within 90 days most of the time. If it was a case involving a termination of parental rights or a death penalty case, we had to have an opinion circulated within 90 days. Mm-hmm. And then it would come up for an opinion conference, and then if someone didn't like it and would write in, by email we'd say, I think you need to change this, or I disagree, we'd wind up maybe writing a separate concurring opinion or a dissenting opinion. But we really thought them through.
Did that have any adverse effect on the collegiality, which is necessary?
No, we disagreed a lot of times. There was an abortion case, Planned Parenthood against Sundquist. It was a 4-1 decision, and I was the one. And that took about a year to get that opinion out because Chief Justice then was Riley Anderson. He was writing for the majority, and he would write a draft, and I'd come back with a dissent, and he would come back and ratchet up the majority, and I'd come back and and it was like tooth and nail, but we were always buddies. Never let it get personal.
I think it's important for people to understand that, and that tension is really a positive.
Yeah.
Do you not think it is?
Oh, absolutely. That's why you got a collegial court.
When you were on the trial bench and on the Court of Appeals, did you participate in the judicial conferences?
Yes, not as much as a trial judge. I was a little bit derelict as a trial judge. I didn't go to some of them. But when I was on the appellate courts, I was at all of them.
What did you think of the effectiveness of the judicial conference in building up the judiciary?
It's great. My concern now is because of lack of funding, the judicial conferences have been shortened. For example, today a judicial conference will begin about noon on a Wednesday, and it'll go that afternoon, and then it'll go Thursday, and then Friday morning there's a little winding up, and a lot of people have gone home, so they may only be together one night and one day. And when we had money to do it the way it should be done, we would go in on Tuesday and leave on Friday, meet 3 times a year.
Why is that important?
It's important to know what other problems other judges are facing that may be common problems, and get some good tips about practice habits. Don Payne, for example, would come every year and give us his Tennessee law update. Believe it or not, we need that. We had some great seminars. Docket management, case management, how to deal with you'd be surprised at people that really don't understand the law of contempt. We have, just good stuff.
While you were on the Court of Criminal Appeals, what did you learn about the criminal laws of the state and the direction they seem to be going since the laws are passed by the legislature?
They're getting tougher and tougher. And the law in 1989, a fellow named David Raymond, I don't know if you know David, lawyer from Nashville, great lawyer, great mind. He's a defense lawyer, but he's also been over in the Attorney General's office. He probably knows as much about criminal law as anyone. And he had a large hand in the criminal law revision in '89. And the goal was one of the goals was to reduce disparity in sentencing. In the old days, for example, you get convicted of armed robbery, it was 10 years to life. And so you have one fellow who's a cellmate, and he's been convicted of armed robbery. He's got a 10-year sentence. The other guy's got a 25-year sentence, and they wonder, why did I get one and another? So the idea was to come up with some really sentencing guidelines on enhancement factors and aggravating circumstances that would take away a lot of the subjective sentencing. And I think that's good. That was one of the goals.
Do you think incarceration is always the best solution for punishment?
No. Depends on the crime. Of course, I'm not a legislator. My job is to enforce the law, not to write the law. But if I were in the legislature, I would make some changes, probably.
Well, you have a perception because you see these cases.
Yeah,
That's
well,
the reason
I think a lot of drug cases don't need to have people in the penitentiary. I can remember back in the early 70s, 1971, 72, when if someone were caught with one marijuana cigarette, they might get 5 years. That was a pretty excessive sentence. Those laws have changed somewhat, but there are a lot of people in the penitentiary who probably could be rehabilitated or be law-abiding without having to serve active time. A lot of community service, a lot of intensive probation. We've got hundreds of thousands of dollars, tied up in incarceration expenses. I forget, I haven't kept up with it the last couple of years, but it seemed like at one time we had something like 44,000 people in the state penitentiaries. That's a lot of people.
Let's take a break.
Okay.
And then we're going. You have recently retired from the Tennessee Supreme Court. So you have served on 3 levels of Tennessee courts. How did you happen to go on to the Supreme Court of the state of Tennessee?
Well, Lyle Reed retired in March of 1998, and of course that left a vacancy that needed to be filled, and I thought, well, I might as well apply for it, and so got nothing to lose, and I applied to it was then called the Judicial Selection Commission, and I was one of the 3 folks that they recommended to the governor, and Governor Sundquist again appointed me, so he appointed me to both courts, to the Court of Criminal Appeals and to the Supreme Court. And I was sworn in by him on, actually, Riley Anderson administered the oath. He was our chief then. That was on April the 8th of 1998. No, April 23rd, 1998, somewhere in April.
What was the most noticeable difference you experienced when you were a member of the Supreme Court as an associate justice after your earlier judicial experience?
Most notable difference is, on the Court of Criminal Appeals, Rule 3 of the Rules of Appellate Procedure give everyone a right to appeal as of right. And on the Supreme Court, it's mostly Rule 11 appeals, which means you get an appeal by the grant of permission. I don't know why we don't call it a writ of certiorari, but they call it an application for permission to appeal. So they only grant a relatively few number of cases for specific reasons. Perhaps just to clarify some rule of law that hasn't been clarified, to develop the law. So it's something that's a fairly important issue, and because of that, we don't take that many cases, and we spend a lot more time and a lot more care in preparing our decision, because the Supreme Court of Tennessee is the final court on the say of what the rule of law is in Tennessee. And we spend a lot of time discussing which cases to grant permission to appeal in. The lawyer might get a one-sentence order back upon due consideration. The application for permission to appeal is denied. And they have spent a lot of time and a lot of work trying to get it ready, and they say, well, they didn't even look at it. But we may have looked at that case for 2 or 3 months and had a lot of discussion about it before we find. So each case, a lot of discussion went in, a lot of preparation went in, and I love doing that.
What's the process for winnowing the cases so that before you decide to take a case?
Well, we would, there's a rule, and I forget which one it is now, that sort of outlines our criteria for granting permission to appeal. But in general, it has to be a case that has a relative degree of importance, beyond just the importance it has to the two litigants, but to the population of the state as a whole. It may be that one section of the Court of Appeals has reached a different conclusion than another section on a similar or the same issue. It may be on some question that we think we need to write on because we've never decided the issue before. It may be because we want to develop the law further than it has been before. It may be because we want to announce that we don't want to develop the law any further than we did before. But it has to be a decision that is going to make a difference.
Do you remember the first experience you had listening to arguments and preparing for to hear those arguments?
I don't remember the first one, but I certainly remember. I remember what we would do.
What would you do?
The Supreme Court is a hot court. And when I say hot, I mean we've all familiarized ourselves with the case, and we know what the issues are. And you don't have to come into court and inform us about what the case is about. We know what it's about. We've all read the applications for permission to appeal. We've had our staff attorneys prepare a memorandum. We've researched the case. So when we come into the courtroom, we pretty well know what the issues are and what we need to ask. And it was really interesting to have those great discussions with some of the lawyers that would teach. Some judges say oral argument really doesn't change my mind. Well, that wasn't true for me. I've had my mind changed any number of times during oral argument. So I would recommend to all lawyers never waive oral argument. If a case is worth appealing, it's worth arguing.
Before you went on the bench to actually hear argument, how would you prepare yourself?
Well, number one, I would read the application for permission to appeal. We had 8 staff attorneys, all located in Nashville. Some of them were experts, I say experts, were knowledgeable more so than others in the areas of civil law, some in criminal law. And each one would be assigned to write a memorandum. And when we would look at the memorandum, we might ask them to write something else. We would do our own independent. I guess each of us would go about it in a different way, but my way would be I would look at the memorandum that had come in along with the application for permission to appeal. I might ask my law clerks at home to do a little research on an issue, and I might even, probably not often, but I might even go back and start reading the transcript, but probably would not read the transcript unless I needed to after argument. You just can't do it all before argument.
Would you go in to hear argument sometimes with a list of specific questions you wanted the lawyer to address?
Yes. I might not write them down, but I'd have them in my mind. And it was interesting because you could listen to your colleagues on the court, and sometimes they would ask questions exactly of what you had in mind, and sometimes they would ask questions you hadn't even thought about. And sometimes it would be interesting because you would get into a banter with another member of the court by the questions you were asking. You would ask a question to somebody, but if you don't like that, and you can see there's a banter going on with the lawyer being the interpreter between the judges.
How many law clerks did you have?
Had two.
How did you use them?
I used them to help me write opinions. I used them to help me do research on specific topics. That was about it. Sometimes I'd even have them write letters for me.
When you were on the Supreme Court, did you enjoy civil cases more or criminal cases more? Or did you enjoy them? Or is enjoy the right term to use?
You know, it's interesting, but I perhaps could say if I had to choose between the two, it might be criminal. In most criminal cases that we took, there would always be some constitutional issue squeezed in there. And I always loved constitutional law. And criminal cases, you know, to the public, they may think, well, a criminal lawyer is really not on the same high plane as a civil lawyer. But boy, the issues in those criminal cases sometimes are the most challenging of all. And I really enjoyed the criminal cases. Not to say that I didn't like the civil cases, but the criminal cases sometimes would really be challenging.
When you were hearing argument, if you were blindfolded, could you tell the difference between lawyers from East Tennessee and lawyers from Middle Tennessee, and lawyers from West Tennessee?
You're talking about the way they argued or their accents?
The way they argued. The way they handled the case.
Not really.
Could you tell difference in their accents?
Yes. Yes, I've got one of the strongest East Tennessee accents you can imagine, and it sure is different than somebody from Memphis.
We do have 3 states of Tennessee, don't we? During your years on the bench, what were, to your mind, the significant changes in the rules?
Max, I'm sure if I thought about it, I could come up with some answer, but right now I'm just drawing a blank.
Were there any differences in judicial administration during your decade on the bench?
I can't really think of any right now. I'm embarrassed to tell you that. I know when I became Chief Justice, I spent an awful lot of time on administration. Spent a lot of time. We had some good people running the administrative office of courts. We had one when I first went on to court that wasn't as efficient as perhaps he should have been, and he was replaced in 1999 by Connie Clark, who had been a trial judge down in the 22nd Judicial District, which was down in Franklin and 5 other counties. And she resigned from her position as a trial judge and came and did a crackerjack job of managing that office. You know, they had about 75 employees in that office, and she was a wonderful manager. And of course, now she's our Chief Justice and came on the court in 2008. But there's a lot of personnel issues you have to deal with as chief. When the legislature's in session, you have to spend a lot of time dealing with legislative issues, with budgeting issues, and yet you still have to write your opinions. And so it's challenging, but as the budgetary crisis began to mount, we had to make some hard decisions, and I think the court is still having to make hard decisions about personnel and about what you can do with the money you do have and the money you don't have, what you can try to replace it with. The federal grants that we used to get are beginning to shrink. State funding has shrunk, and so you have to try to make the best you can do with what you have, and that's getting hard. For example, we talked earlier about being able to go out to the College of the Judiciary out in Reno, the State Judicial College. We used to be able to send people out almost yearly if they wanted to go, and there was a course, but those days are over.
When did you become Chief Justice?
September 2005, upon the retirement of Chief Justice Frank Dorota.
How were you selected?
Interestingly, the court selects its own chief, and so the remaining members of the court thought I could do the job and elected me.
When you became Chief Justice, how much of your time did you have to spend on being the public face of the court?
Quite a bit.
Speeches
I think the present court may be making more public speeches than I perhaps did. You know, I see something almost in the paper daily where, after I left, where Janice Holder, when she became chief, was out in the public a lot, and Connie Clark is continuing that. But I spent a lot of time giving speeches and going around the state and helping teach seminars and just being there.
Is that important?
Yes, yes. You know, we had a project that Riley Anderson, when he was chief, started in 1995, called SCALES, which stands for Supreme Court Advancing Legal Education for Students. And so when invited by trial judges around the state, we would go into those districts and we would hear cases in front of high school students, and it was really one of the best programs in the country for that. And I guess we've, as a Supreme Court, during my 10.5 years on the court, probably held court in at least, there are 95 counties in the state. We've probably held court during my 10.5 years, probably in 35 of those counties. And it gives high school students an opportunity to see real cases.
Have you thought any about what the judiciary can do, the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals and the judges on the trial benches, to help people of the state better understand the role of the judiciary?
Well, I think occasions like Law Day every year on May the 1st offer an absolute fabulous opportunity for judges and lawyers to speak in the schools, to speak to civic audiences and to others about what the judiciary actually does and the rule of law. There are other occasions I, for one, would love to see civics classes back in the classrooms. That's sort of gone by the wayside, and I'd like to see the judicial branch of government and the bar associations advocate for perhaps having volunteer teachers go in and teach 1 or 2 days a week. Doesn't have to be the same lawyer, the same judge, but go into the schools and teach basic civics. That's something that's just fallen by the wayside, not only in Tennessee, but around the country.
I want to switch back to one of those practical things that people wonder about. When you were going to write an opinion on a case, how do you go about constructing an opinion?
First thing I would decide is how I'm going to rule. And then after discussion with the members of the court and hearing their views, I want to draft the opinion in such a manner as to try to accommodate as much as possible the views expressed by the other judges. You know, I don't have to put in a sentence that I know is going to make somebody upset. I need to add a sentence or two that's going to make somebody get on board that may have been wavering one way or the other. I want to draft it in a way that is going to make the least amount of change that's required to reach the decision. I don't want to answer questions that weren't advanced or don't need to be answered. And so I try to make it as pithy as I can, although sometimes my opinion's got to be pretty long. And others of the court, I wrote a dissent one time that was 28 pages long. That's 28 pages in West, which I think may have been excessive. But I was answering a majority opinion that's about 30 pages long. So I'd write, and after I'd write one, I'd put it on the shelf and let it sit about a week or two, then pick it up and read it again. And I'd always say, why did I write that? That doesn't sound good. And so I'd go back and look at it again, but try to let it sit for a few days and let me go back and look at it fresh. And the amazing thing is today I can go back and read some opinion and say, did I write that? And I don't remember saying that. I had a law clerk once, and he's now a partner in this law firm, and his office is right next to mine, named Tom Greenholz. He has a photographic memory. He can tell you every opinion that ever came out of our office and what the issues were and the name of the lawyer. I mean, it's incredible, and I don't have a memory like that.
We all wish we had memories like that. Tell us briefly about the importance of dissenting opinions.
Well, number one, it gives the dissenting justice an opportunity to vent. Number two, often the dissents of today become the majority opinions of tomorrow. And we can, as lawyers, you and I can think of any number of cases. You know, take Plessy against Ferguson back in the 1890s on segregation of public transportation. You know, that dissent became the majority opinion later when Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the majority back in 1953 in Brown versus Board of Education. And it gives an opportunity for the legal scholars to critique the opinions of the majority. So I think dissenting opinions have their place, but I don't think judges ought to dissent unless they feel fairly strongly about an issue.
What are you doing now?
Well, I'm associated in the law firm that you're with, Chambers, Bonner, and Stoffel in Chattanooga. I'm of counsel, and primarily I'm engaged in arbitration and mediation. And from time to time, some of the lawyers in the firm might ask me to do something special, like, you know, give them my thoughts about a brief they're writing and what I would suggest they ought to emphasize. But I don't go to court. I just don't think it's appropriate for me to be in a courtroom. Others may disagree with that. Certainly there have been other members of the court who've retired and gone back to court, but for me personally, I don't think I need to do that. And I go and come as I please.
Do you enjoy the arbitration and mediation?
Yes, yes.
Find it intellectually stimulating?
Well, I like arbitration better than mediation. Arbitration to me is easier. In mediation, you have to go in and plead with them, cry with them, beg them, laugh with them, cajole them, and I go home at night and I'm just worn out. And in arbitration, that's pretty much like being a judge, and that comes a little easier for me.
What are your hobbies?
Traveling, cooking, reading history. That's about it.
What are you reading now?
Well, I just got through reading, this is an old book, but it's still one I've read it for the second time. This is a book by a fellow named Johnson. What's his first name? He's an English writer. Johnson's his last, I can't remember first name. It's called A History of the American People. And it's a one-volume history that starts with the Portuguese exploration in the late 1400s and goes through Bill Clinton's first term. It's all in one volume, about 1,000 pages, and fabulous. And I'll think of his first name in a minute.
What's the next book you want to read? Do you have one on tap?
Yeah, it's not out yet. John Meacham has got a book coming out probably this summer on Jefferson.
Are there any future lawyers in your family? Do you have any grandchildren who you think might be interested in the law?
Not at this point. My oldest grandchild is a little girl 10 years old, and my youngest, a little grandson, 4 years old. So I don't think they've even given any thought to what they want to be, but none of my children wanted to be lawyers.
Looking back over your life, Mickey, what are some things in which you take most satisfaction?
Helping my wife raise 3 great children. You know, they're all married, they're all happy, they all got good homes, and I got great grandchildren. That's what I take most pride in. My relationship to my Lord and helping develop the law.
Thank you.